Jean, you have your hand up. Is that volunteering?
Yeah, I'll take notes.
Thank you very much. You're the stucky way too often, but thank you.
All right. Welcome to STIR. See if I can convince the slide deck to progress. Well, this is new. One moment while we figure this out.
Okay, so while he's getting that figured out, remind everybody about the note well, and that the Jabber and CodeMD URLs are at the bottom of the agenda if you need them.
Good. I'm control again.
Okay, good. There's the note well. Given it's Friday, you've probably seen this a lot already this week. Next slide. We have a very large agenda for a 1 hour slot. We'll try and keep the pace moving. And if we don't get to everything, we will schedule an interim, virtual interim in a couple of weeks.
There are, it's a lot more time between this meeting and the next than there was between this and the last. I expect we will have at least one virtual between this meeting and the next in any case. But as Russ noted, if we don't finish our agenda today, we'll have one very soon. And yes,
Okay.
Any bashing?
Yeah, any bashing? Okay, the first two drafts I expect are going to be short because they're pretty far along in the process, but we'll start with that. CERT delegation.
How's it going?
Hi.
So yeah, next slide. My pandemic hair is looking worse than usual this morning. So yeah, just a quick update on things in flight. We have some RFCs now for out-of-band and diversion. Wow, like, you know, after these have been practiced for years, we finally have RFCs for those. That's always a good thing eventually. So certificate delegation has been revised to reflect actually our discussion previously about things like removing the ability to let intermediate certs sign passports. We're requiring e-certs for that now, which is just, you know, an administrative task really rather than much of a technical change. There are a few other miscellaneous things. Obviously, Ben, as usual, had some very detailed and insightful comments that we managed to plow our way through on that. But hopefully we'll be hearing back from them about that soon. And that's it on this, since we have a long agenda. Next.
We were going to just take this moment to say regarding the RPH Emergency Services document, that is now just finished IESG evaluation. So it's shifted just yesterday, I believe, to the RC editor's queue.
Yep.
And the next one we're talking about is rich call data. Chris or John? That must be Chris.
That's me. Hey, everyone. You can hear me okay, right?
Yep.
Cool. Yeah, so quite a bit to talk about, but I'll try to go through it quickly. Hopefully it makes sense. and I'll also reference, since they're sort of jointly dependent on each other, the SIP core document as well. But the major thing to talk about is integrity mechanism. But next slide. So just I have a list of all the different edits here. I think John had a comment about maybe 160 characters was a little too long, although he still say should. So updated that. I added and this is maybe an important thing to, get feedback on. I added a must for URI usage. As I was looking through all of the properties in JCard, there's one exception, which I note in the next bullet point, which is URL, but there really doesn't seem to be much need for having multiple layers of URIs. So I thought, just to nip a security hole or potential security hole, I put some text to say that, you can only have one URI reference, and I say unless updated by a future spec. But let me know if you have any comments around that, or see any other anticipated usage of nested URIs. The next one, I put some guidance in specific to URL. So like URL would probably be like a web page that you want to send to the callee or something like that. I say something about, oh, I'm sorry, that's not the next one, but I'll talk about it anyways. I have some guidance in the URL section that says do not follow links automatically or that type of language, that just for guidance about not following web pages. The next bullet actually is about multimedia file usage. So that and this goes to some of the integrity needs that we have, and the potential uses of multiple images to represent multiple resolutions or file formats that different devices may be able to render or not render. So I talk about some guidance around that. I've included cardinality from the JCard spec directly, just for convenience, but that goes to the point of which properties specifically we can add multiple instances of. The original spec I had some must should. I was trying to think about what should clients implement as a must versus a should, and I think just decided that that wasn't necessarily necessary, and it wasn't clear what was must versus should, so I actually just removed that type of language. But but to be clear, I don't include all of the JCard properties. I only include a set that I think are relevant to calls, or even remotely relevant to calls, telephone calls. There's a bunch that are obviously not relevant to telephone calls, but I'd like people to review that and make sure that I'm not limiting something or even feedback about what I have included. Next page. Unless there's any comments about that document specifically. Okay, so for the RCD spec, like I said, a new update to integrity and modes. I have a few dedicated slides for that, so I'll leave that to that. There's some clarification I made in the text for the third-party section with ISS. We've had a little bit of discussion of that in various forums. But just to clarify that the distinction is between first party and third party use cases. It's only for you third party use cases that you use ISS, and that is essentially the indicator of that. Also, there was a change to clarify that rather than just organizational field, the subject name more generally should reflect the ISS. Oh yeah, there was a security note for using RCD claims as part of passports that are not part of RCD extensions, passports that aren't RCD passports, that if there's integrity rules, we want to make sure that any JWT constraints that are applied to RCD passports, if they're transferred into any other passports, you recognize the security implications of those types of things. I think in general, I guess I had a blip there or something.
You're back.
Great.
Yeah, you dropped off and Medico reconnected you. So you're on slide 4, right? Last bullet.
Yeah, this is must exclude and all that.
Am I back?
Yes, you're back.
Okay, sorry about that. Had a blip, I guess. Were you clarifying, John?
Like teeing up what the last bullet was. Go on, please.
Oh, okay. Yep. So yeah, I heard must exclude. So yeah, I added in the security considerations part of the document the use of that. Let me know if there's any thoughts that it should be included any other place. But I thought that was appropriate, at least for now. Okay, next page. Okay, so to get a little bit more detailed into the integrity updates, basically got a couple of feedback from folks that are starting to implement this. And I think they were good enough points that really did need to extend this a little more. One point was that if the integrity is broken, if you detect that the digest isn't matching, it isn't possible, like with a single digest, it isn't possible for a verifier to determine which part of the RCD claim is actually broken. So, there isn't a possibility for, like, if the image gets changed, you don't know if the integrity of the other parts, the other, parts of the RCD are broken or not. So you have no information that you can provide. The second part is when you have multiple images or URI content that you don't necessarily support, with a single digest, you basically, you're forced to download all the content in order to calculate the digest, and that would be a burden on a device that and unnecessary. So proposing a new framework, which has a lot more flexibility. Actually, I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. It defines a way to define multiple digests. It solves both of those problems. And it actually has sort of a nice property that it could cover, if you want to cover multiple objects with one digest, you can still actually do that. But, the general usage is probably just targeting like URIs and things like that. And the nice thing is use this sort of part of JSON spec, JSON pointer, which does have pretty wide implementation, where it provides a nice sort of compact way of pointing to what part of the RCD that the digest is being used. So next page shows some examples. So I have two examples. One is using a JCL, one is using a JCD. So this is the JCD version where the URIs are included directly in the claims itself. If you look at the RCDI below, I have a digest that's over the entire JCD, and then I have a digest that's over the contents, I mean, of the RCD JCard, and then digests that are specific to each of the URLs. So I sort of color coded what the JSON pointer references. If you go to the next slide, one caveat with this, and I sort of took the liberty of defining a little bit of a shortcut here, and certainly would like to get feedback on that, is this doesn't, when you use the JCL, when you use a URI linked content, so in other words, this vcard or JCard JSON that's linked, that doesn't exactly follow the rules of JSON pointer. I'm sort of trying to connect it where the /JCL, if there's a slash after that, it sort of assumes that you're going into the JSON as if it was part of the original JSON object. So that just helps keep it compact and nice and not have any odd rules there, but it is sort of an extension to the JSON pointer spec, and I provide text to explain those rules, but I just wanted to note that and maybe get some comments. Maybe I'll pause here if there's any comments anyone has about the mechanism in general or the use of JSON pointer, or just make sure I'm giving people the ability to comment.
I'll at least say something. This is John. Yeah, so we looked at this quite a bit, and it is a little bit of a hack, as Chris said, the way that first line of the RCDI works in this instance, given how JSON pointer works. And I know when I was looking at this, I was initially concerned, if you have to specify with JSON pointer kind of, okay, this is, the first sub-element, third sub-element down, like numerically like that there might be some like ambiguity, like if there's some reordering or, some way that somebody could like sneak something into the JCard. So, and I think I'm persuaded anyway that having that first line, though, that ability to just have a signature over the entire thing is a sufficient guarantee that you're preserving like the lexical order of the elements of the URIs that are referenced below. And, it does seem useful to be able to have these individual integrity protections over the contents of those URIs, especially with, as Chris said, the fact we're not allowing like 60 levels of embedded like URLs that you're going to be traversing like through this. Certainly, if any scheme moved beyond like one level of dereferencing, I'd have some skepticism about the applicability of this, but kind of given the limited scope we're choosing for this, I think this should work okay.
Just for clarity, the first line is always required. The other ones are optional. Is that right?
Yeah.
Because I thought we wanted,
like if you're not doing the preceding lines, if the yeah, I'm pretty sure that's how I wrote it, that the first line is always mandatory. But I'll double check on that.
So because what we were after, I think, is the hashes of the content that you're going to get back from the dereferencing the URL, right? Except the first line, which is a hash of the structure itself.
Correct.
Okay.
In this case, it's the content of the file because it is a URI. In the preceding page, it is the direct content that's the claim that it's pointing to.
Oh, but because it's got the text thing there.
Right.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that explanation.
Yep.
Seems like it works, right? Like that. I think this, provided the anyways at the first line, that this is secure.
Yep.
It
Okay.
seems fine to me.
Great. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure, I guess, Rush, you had pushed for the integrity thing. I wanted to make sure that it's maintaining the property that you had originally proposed. Brian?
I don't know if this is any help, but there is a piece of work going on now to do a JSON path, which is an equivalent to XPath. It has a lot more expressiveness. I don't really remember whether it can do what you're trying to accomplish in this first line or not. And it's not a standard yet. It's just work in progress.
Yeah.
But we might want to look to see if that would actually do it. It's more complicated. And so, JSON pointer is much simpler.
Right. I don't know about JSON path specifically, but I know about XPath, and I suspect it probably could do that. I don't know if it would do it in as compact of a form. I know it probably has way more functionality than we need for this. So I'm
way more.
Right. So I'm just thinking simpler is better, but I can look at that a little bit and see if there's anything there.
I mean, in an ideal world, when I was looking at this, I was like, it'd be great if actually, the keys in the RCDI stanza could refer to the actual names like photo, logo. And so the problem is then you have multiple versions of logo. You need to differentiate, and basically you end up with something that looks pretty much like this at the end of the day. So, I mean, I think this is probably sufficient for what we're trying to do anyway.
Yeah, I suspect so. Okay. Any other comments? All right. I wanted to go over this part quick. So originally we had talked about 3 modes. It was pretty clear once we sort of thought, a little more deeply at this, that there's really, it's better to think about this in 2 dimensions. One is whether the signer is authoritative over the information or non-authoritative, and that generally corresponds to whether a delegate certificate's being used or not, although it might not be strictly that. And then the other dimension is whether there's URI references or not. So I think this lays it out a little more clearly, and is what we originally intended anyways. And just has the very clear rules that, like RCD integrity is needed when there's URI references, and JWT claims constraints is needed when you're providing this to a non-authoritative signer. So I put some text in there to explain that, to replace the original 3-mode description.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing on this that I keep wondering about, because JWT constraints, the claims constraints, they're not, I'm always worried there's some mischief where like you can put in a hash for some, let's say you have both like logo and icon or something, and you put your hashes for both logo and icon into the bucket of the JWT claims constraints? And could you mix them up, or like, is there some way you, then could reorder them in the J card? But again, I think the lexical ordering helps in that you make sure that you actually are associating the right image with the right field in the J card. And so I have like still some nagging doubts about this, but as far as I can tell, it works.
Yeah.
I mean, the problem is you can't.
It's not the lexical ordering; it's the digest of the claims. It's the JCAR claims itself that make sure that the lexical order is the same, I guess.
Yes.
Right.
And so you can't like pretend that this logo is your, icon and this icon is your logo or something. Yeah, I think it works.
Right. Okay. Any other questions on that? I think other than that, I know we're sort of, we had already initiated work group last call, and this is, substantive changes. So I guess I'd look back to what we think we should do. We should have a little more review of this and then continue, or, but I felt like this was important enough to make these changes.
Well, I think this is a substantive change, and I think we should just redo working group last call just to make sure that everybody's had a chance to look at it. You think it's stable at this point and it's ready for that?
Well, certainly, I will share this more broadly in the other groups that are relevant. So I think giving it, maybe a meeting cycle would be good.
So maybe in a week or so, we'll just do a STIR working group last call and flesh out, that'll flush out reviewers.
Exactly. Yep. All right. That's it for me, if there isn't any other questions. Jack, did you have a question?
Yeah, Jack, activate your mic, man.
Yeah, I found the button. Yeah, I do actually have a quick question about not the RCD stuff, the ISS claim. It can't. I believe the language at the moment is something like it must reflect the subject name of the certificate, but reflect is very vague, and I was just wondering if there's any aim to put something a bit more parsable by a computer in there so that we can actually check that.
Yeah. We have sort of similar thing with, just the subject of, in general, the certificates for STIR-shaken as well. We provide some, like, at least in the ATA specs, we provide guidance about including the SBC and the name of the company. I don't know. John, do you have any comments on that?
I mean, we've gone back and forth about this, and I think this is still a little half-baked, to be honest, and we'll need to sort this out. I think it's largely starting on the ATA side, to be honest, just in the sense of whatever we do, it has to be compatible with the way that we imagine these things can be used, especially in the delegate cert context for ATAs. And so, I mean, that's kind of like a PA, GA level decision, right? It's like how, and we've gone back and forth, should it be the organization? Should it be the subject name? What component of it is it supposed to reflect? And who vets those? And so I don't disagree that there's a little bit of fungibility around all that still that we're working through. And we'll just have to get that nailed down this cycle.
Okay, I'm happy as long as it's going to be looked at some point, because yeah, at the moment you just can't really use it.
Yeah, it's a known issue.
ultimately you need to be authorized to have a certificate. So I think that bounds it, but I think it's sort of a, I don't know if there's strict security associated with that association, right, John?
Is that, whoever, either CSR or like some, other policy that sets what CSR is supposed to look like, right, is gonna end up determining like what that looks like. And so, and I think the problem is we haven't really all gelled on what do you do, especially for these like enterprise, certificate delegation cases on the, on the shaken side, right? And I don't think the IETF spec needs to be prescriptive about that, but it needs to be aligned. And this is the problem, right? Is that we just need to make sure that whatever we're doing doesn't end up stomping on or being incompatible with, right? Whatever the decision is on the ATA side about that.
Yeah, and to be clear, we have talked about studying this in the IPN&I side, so it will get looked at.
IETF stuff to keep it, as open as we can, so that then people are going to profile, because who knows what various other people who are looking at this are going to want to do for it. So I kind of want the IETF version of this to be a blanket, not too prescriptive version of it. And it'll end up getting nailed down for the North American Shaken ecosystem anyway in ATIS. And that's, it's a very familiar tune that we sing in this group. All right, so why don't I talk a little bit about this draft, which actually I'm going to punt on basically for the cycle for time reasons. So next slide. So I'd rather talk about connected identity and messaging today. So, yeah, this is the draft we have that is looking at out-of-band from a slightly different security model, where actually it is an entity, the CPS is an entity that's operating on behalf of somebody who sees the call signaling anyway. And so we're looking at it from, this is not an entity from whom you need to keep private details like who is calling who, because they're going to see the actual invites and or SS7 messaging or whatever else is associated with that. And so as a consequence of that, we can relax the security model a bit. Next slide. So this was a very minor update this time, in part because there's still a lot of things that are shaking out in the industry that I'm waiting on this. This is a topic of some discussion over at the GSMA Fines group. Obviously in ATIS, in the PTSC, there's discussion about alternative authorization models for storage and retrieval that are focused kind of more on the gatewaying transit carrier cases, or kind of an adapter sort of case where you're doing out of band just to kind of bridge people into the IPN&I. And, similar to the philosophy I was just expounding a moment ago, we want to make sure that the spec we have for this encompasses the options that are being explored in different spaces for this without, stipulating anything that would make it incompatible with one of those approaches. This is always a difficult needle to thread. Definitely the exact relationship between the CPS and service providers in this is another case that we're, there's just variance, for example, looking at the way that the GSMA is looking at this versus the way that PTSC is looking at this. And so, as a consequence of that, I'm kind of working through that stuff, and we'll have more on this later. So yeah, it's kind of parking lot update. Next slide. So yeah, we'll revise, and things are still a ways from being settled for this one. I expect next time we'll have more to say about it. That's all I want to say this time, because I want to move on to cooler things we want to talk about here. Any questions before we do so? Sounds like there are none. All right, Russ.
Okay, next slide, please. So the original syntax for JWT constraints allowed you to mandate the inclusion of a particular claim, but you could not mandate that particular things could not be included. So next slide. The revision basically says you must include particular claims, that if a claim is present, it must contain one of a listed values. That was the old. The new includes those two, plus a list of claims that must not appear, and if a claim does appear, a list of values it must not contain. Next slide. That's just the rest of the syntax. That's essentially between those two slides, the entire ASN1 module. This part is also compatible, although a couple names changed to facilitate reuse of the data structures in the second part that was added. Next slide. So here's a simple example. It says the first part that the confidence claim must be present in the passport. And the next part says the confidence claim must contain either high or medium. And then the third part says that the priority claim must not be present. And the fourth part says if the assurance claim is present, it must not have a value of low. So those are the kinds of statements that the new syntax allows, which is in line with Chris's requirements that he just talked about. Next slide. I am not aware of any outstanding comments, and I think it's ready for working group last call, unless anybody has comments now. Obviously, since I took the pen on this one, Robert will make any consensus calls. I think that's it. Like to hear whether people think it is ready for working group last call.
I believe it is ready for working group last call.
Yeah, +1 for me.
Okay, Robert, would you take that action, please, after probably next week? All right.
Sure.
Next presentation.
Okay, stir for messaging, very exciting. Next slide. So this is a document that Chris and I put together that is exploring the possibility of using the same kinds of credentials that we use to sign calls with STIR to actually sign messages in some form. And those can be either message streams or individual messages, like using the message method. And the idea for the moment is we're scoping it to basically just things that use RFC 8226 credentials, in other words, things with a TN auth list, as opposed to more generic email style identifiers, what have you, for SIP. Why are we doing this? We do believe message spam is a problem. I have a slide about that. And it would really just be silly if people were to be looking at solutions for signing messaging that was based on telephone numbers that did not use the credentials that in fact are being rolled out very widely due to regulatory mandates and US law and everything else. It seems reasonable to have a way to do this where those messages will end up being secured by STIR certificates. We still are looking hard at this last question though, like where do we get into this ecosystem? Obviously it's an entrenched ecosystem with a ton of participants, ton of legacy tech. And so the very real question, I think, as we look towards adoption is whether we think this will really make a difference or get utilized. Next slide. So is there really a problem? I mean, we've seen some reports on the mailing list of people saying this isn't really a problem. I just wanted to, from my personal experience, this says that this is a text I got yesterday. I guess I made these slides on Wednesday, so that would have been when I got on Tuesday. I at least get a lot of this stuff. I don't know of anybody else, but I'm really not that sympathetic to the argument that messaging spam from telephone numbers is not an issue. Definitely, there are other mitigation strategies that exist. Obviously, there are a lot of service bureaus who are doing great work, kind of email style analysis of messages in order to try to break this down. I at least think it would be great if you could not spoof the numbers associated with messages and if there was some accountability from where they originated. And I don't know if anybody on this call wants to go to bat for it's not a problem. Looking at the attendee list, I'm not sure I see too many people who are making that argument, but if anybody would like to make the argument, speak now.
I'm going to go the other way. I want it. I want it for 911 among other things, but I want it.
Am I up? I assume people can hear me. I make see little squiggly bars. I'm also in support, so I'm not going to stand up to object. I think there's bigger use cases than just preventing spam. I think there are potential use cases around here on making sure real messages are trustworthy, especially when people are doing 2FA and all sorts of scary things like that with text messaging.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of TFA considered harmful these days that hopefully we could nip in the bud with something like this. So yeah, I don't mean to say that this is like just for spam. I know Brian wants it for something very different, for example, but like I want to make it clear, I think there's spam and like I would like that to be fixed. So next slide. And this is a broader question. I know I think Krister's on, raised this one. Is this really in the scope of STIR? I've made the argument on the list that I believe it is, that really once we made MKey in scope, binding passports to media security necessarily became part of STIR. Obviously, we use this for SIP Brandy. And to me, I don't really see a huge distinction between using MKey for like DTLS over DTLS SRDP versus MSRP over TLS. I can see that message I is different. I think that draws on the precedent of our CDI, but I at least wanted to have this discussion. I mean, I think this is one of the points we need to get through on this. Are there people here who want to make the case really doing messaging should not be in the scope of STIR? Mr. Scorla.
Well, I'm certainly not here to make that case. I guess it would just be, I'd like to get a slightly better sense of the, of how you see the problem being scoped. Namely, like, there's like one version where it's like, hey, we'll create it. I mean, STIR already has like a certificate, so there's like some like silly version where it's like, well, look, it's a certificate, it's S-MIME, we're not mission accomplished, right? And then there's some like other extreme version where it's like, hey, we're gonna invest in an entirely new thing, like end to end. So like, do you have a sense of like where you cut that line?
I mean, we cut the line, I think, at full suite security for SIP. I mean, that was the intention anyway with MKey and the whole SIP Brandy effort, right? Was to say we want a way to bind the security of the media, the sessions set up with SIP, like to the STIR assurance. And so like, I think anything that is, has roughly that property, that's what I informally understand to be the scope. I mean, I'm also not sure what the creep is. Like, if we're really just concerned about things that are either secured by MKey or this new message integrity, parameter that we propose to add, like, I think that pretty clearly binds it to this is the content that SIP is either negotiating or delivering, like that counts as the media, and like that's what we're trying to secure with that. Is that good enough? Or
yeah, that seems reasonable. Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'm not worried about like I'm also not worried about like whether it's in scope for this working group. Like that's like the kind of thing. That's the kind of like administrative thing we fix regularly. So, I guess just as usual, I just want to like avoid embedding any things we didn't have to embed.
Yeah. I mean, the only thing that's vaguely new we're doing here is this message I thing. Is the notion you could actually have like an integrity signature over the contents of a message itself that's conveyed by like the SIP message method or something. That's the only thing here that, from my perspective, is actually like new. Chris?
Just gonna, I don't know if this is an obvious statement or not, but like in terms of scope, this is really just protecting the fact that the message came from the person that's associated with the telephone number. It doesn't imply anything else about that content, or if that person is sending content that is illegitimate or whatever, it's on them. So I don't think it implies anything further than that. I don't know if that's an important thing to distinguish or not. Maybe it's obvious, but it should be said.
No, fair enough. I mean, it's never going to give us anything beyond what baseline stir gives us, right? And that's certainly if we're going beyond that, I would be concerned that we aren't really in the scope of stir. So, I mean, to the chairs, I mean, should we consider this issue based on the list discussion in this? We kind of agree. Do you want to do a consensus call, show of hands? Do people think that this is in the scope of stir? How do you want to do this?
So Russ, if you're not going to jump in, I will suggest that we just proceed. And I'm not hearing a great deal of dissent and concern about it being in scope. It was good that the question was raised, but I think we've looked at it, and I don't think that we're really going to have controversy.
Okay, I know we're running short on time, so next slide. So this whole question of exactly what a message is certainly the biggest, I think, open issue around this, in the sense of like there's a billion different formats by which textual messages of various kinds are potentially sent, and like, you know, can we arrive at one thing we say message I is going to actually be securing? And like, can we do this as MIME level security? Yeah, probably we could if we're convinced that everything that we want to cover is, you know, expressed as a MIME button. And you know, a lot of these out of band cases, you know, there are you know, some potential questions about what formats those kinds of protocols use. They're different using protocols than SIP, for example, that are conveying messages, and we still want stir certificates to sign for those messages. Are we just opening this like endless bucket? I mean, I think at this point, my inclination on this would be doing this at the MIME level is probably fine to at least get this started, and saying we'll implement this as MIME level security. Assume that anything you're going to be signing for, even if it's not natively carried as a MIME body, we like, you know, turn it into a MIME body for this or something. Just, you know, anything that can get us to a point where we don't end up having to hunt down the distinctions between the 15 different versions of SMPP there are, you know, and things like that, I think would put us on a better footing towards having like an actual implementable standard. So, I mean, does anybody want to go back for not just doing MIME level security? So I think my proposal would be, let's just do MIME level security because it's easy, you know, and you're just doing one thing and then you're done. It works. We know it worked for the SIP message method. We know there's at least some out of band things that would work for if people cared. And like, I would be content to just do that.
So Ben agreed in chat, and I also agree. I think that's the place to start. Let's find out if there's any problem with it, but I don't see one right from where I sit today.
Yeah, fantastic. Done and done. Brian?
When you, as you have done a couple of times, sometimes in SIP we use call info and we can have a SID and make that the MIME body, but sometimes we also have a URI. And I'd like whatever mechanism we come up with to work for both of those. That's the geolocation case.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's fine. I don't care about the levels of indirection to point to that MIME body. The real question is just, is the
Correct.
format we're signing over MIME?
Correct. It's still a MIME. That's all okay. Great.
Yeah, there will be a pointer that does incorporate SID. So, Krister.
Hi. Yeah, I don't know if an issue, but just something we should keep in mind that we have now also defined the transport of MSRP over data channels. So you may have that taking place somewhere in the network. So just to, it may not have any impact, but just to keep in mind.
So do you think that having, again, we're talking about two modes. We're talking about these two modes, the message I mode, and then, you know, there is a normal kind of stir mode where we're negotiating sessions and streams and using MKey. So this would be something where you could use MKey like to signal the self-signed keys used for MSRP over TLS, for example? Like, is there something that doesn't work if we're using it in that mode?
I don't know. You know, but we need to think about it. But just to keep in mind that if we are, for example, setting up a MSRP session, that it could be converted into a data channel. You may still have SIP for the signaling, so you will still be able to transport everything, but just a transport of the message itself would change. But maybe it doesn't matter. But maybe worth to keep in mind and
yeah, I mean, I think anything we're negotiating with SRTP, we'd be able to figure out a way to make it work, provided that, you know, the keying was available to the AS and BSs, right, at the time that they needed to assert the M key. I mean, are these data channel examples ones where you're not using like TLS at all, or these are just in the clear, or like what's the?
No, you are using the TLS for the data channel.
Okay. Yeah, I think that should probably work with M key then. Chris?
Just curious on that question is, because I'm trying to figure it out in my head, the M key is for the data channel or something with MSRP, or both?
Well, I mean, I think that's kind of the issue he's raising.
That's the issue, right? Yeah, okay. That's what we need.
I mean, I hope there's not like redundant levels of security between the data channel and then MSRP. You know, there's MSRP over TLS over the data channel, and the data channel has its own like DTLS.
Yeah.
So if it's just DTLS, right, and MSRP is over that, I think that should work okay. Ben?
Yep.
Probably looking too deep at details for this part of the discussion, but I'm a little bit concerned about our discussions about M key and focusing on TLS, knowing that TLS is not end-to-end. And almost none of these real world messaging architectures have end-to-end delivery over a single transport.
Yeah, I understand. I mean, again, the SIP brandy case was designed to get you as close to end-to-end as you can. Now, I mean, that, you know, that has this big caveat to it though, right? That like, it's really the authentication and verification services that fix those keys. And if there are hops that are prior to or subsequent to the AS and BS, then, you know, that's just part of the assumed security model of SIP brandy. Now, if there's hops between the AS and BS, right, where the security associations are being terminated in the middle, agreed, that won't work. But I think that's working as intended, in the sense that if there is a man in the middle, that should show up as a security failure for at least the model we'd be proposing here.
I think there are hops that aren't just at the AS and BS. You have things like message stores.
Mm-hmm.
And store and forward and such things. So I don't know the answer to this, but I think we should think hard about whether M key is securing TLS or whether M key is doing object level security, doing some kind of session key for object level security on a session.
I mean, the virtue of doing object level security is precisely that. It can be stored and forwarded, right? If you're using like SIP message for this, then it just works. But like you know, I would kind of put my foot down, I think, on that. If there's some intermediary that is inspecting your messages between the AS and the VS, we want that to show up to the VS as a security failure, or tampering with your messages, I should say. And like that's part of the, I mean, that's working as intended. And it may not be practical for some environments, but I certainly want a mode that works that way. And if we want to define other modes that don't work that way for special environments, we can do that. But that's something I would do after we have established a way to make it so you have this assurance for like, at least between the AS and BS for messaging.
Yeah, I was thinking in terms of probably a better example of something that's between the VS and the destination.
See, but that's the point, that for those, there's a very different like situation, right? And
True.
That's part of the SIP brandy security model. I'm okay with that. It'd be great if everyone had their ASs and VSs like built into their, you know, mobile devices and your phones. But I think we all pragmatically recognize that there are going to be environments where that's not possible. As far as I'm concerned, as soon as the VS terminates the security association, though, anything that happens after the fact, that's the operator's business, the user's business. And like, you know, if we have a model that just lets us get the assurance between whoever has the AS and whoever has the VS, I think we're doing our job. Okay, that's good. So I think we've got a good consensus for my level security on this next slide. Trying to go as fast as I can on this. So, there's still a lot we're thinking about on this. I think we're closer now that we've got some idea that probably this is in scope and that MIME is a good approach to this. My question to the group is, shall we adopt? This is still an individual. I think it's worth doing. I think a lot of people need it. So I leave that to the chairs.
So Robert and I didn't have a chance to kibitz about this, but we have a call for adoption. And I guess we need to make a call for consensus on the list, or make a call about consensus on that call. And so we'll do that next week. If anyone wants to speak against the working group adopting, please say so now. Okay.
Okay,
You
so we have
very few minutes.
Yeah,
4 minutes, yes.
So I'm going to blow through this. Next slide. And just tell people who's coming. I want to call for adoption of this too. So next slide. So this is trying to revise 4916 and the beautiful guidance that John Elwell gave us back in the day and how STIR might work in the backwards direction based on provisional dialogue establishment. This is a very, very crude picture of what something like that might look like, where you're getting, after your invite has gone into some financial institution, signed requests coming in the backwards direction. Next slide. This is good, so you know you actually reached the bank you're trying to call and that you did not in fact get hijacked or something. So in this version, I tried to flesh out a bit more about like how this actually works. This is largely reiterating the guidance in 4916, but with, in my own words and, with some kind of more modern STIR thinking around it. Some arguments why I don't think we can make this work for cancel. I also added a bit about the interaction with div, which I think is very interesting. There are some concerns that surround all that about whether you want to reflect div passports that were received on the terminating side back to the originators so they know why their call ended up where it did. Obviously, whenever we talk about this, there are concerns about what it means to, reveal that forwarding logic, potential business logic or relationships that are associated with that. But I feel like the ability to do that is an important part of this mechanism, even if not everybody is going to want to do it every time. So those are the major things that I added to this, is just kind of fleshing out more. Here's how updates and these kinds of things work. Here's what it would be like to do this for buy and so on. And there's something in common between this draft and the previous one. We are looking at what more requests other than invites reasonably could hold passports. And I think that is, if we're looking at the scoping of STIR in general, that is kind of one of the bigger questions that we're now examining more broadly about where we're taking this going forward now that it's taken off in the marketplace, turns out. Next slide. So yeah, I still need to revise the examples. John had some great examples of this. I think it'd be important to have those in. And to do anything that we actually think is normative revisions to 4916, like things that result from the deprecation of the identity info header in favor of the parameter that's now present in identity. I'm still on the fence of whether this is really a BIS. I'm calling it 4916 update for the moment. Probably it's a BIS. And finally, I know we really want to flesh out more this concept of doing some medialess pre-dialogue for connect identity, so really before media starts that you ended up reaching the right entity and have some expectations around whether or not the entity you're calling is supposed to support STIR and whether you have security in this. So that potentially could be deferred to another draft if we feel like it. But, next slide. My basic question, even though there's still stuff to do here, I think this is a pretty important use case. Again, there are a lot of threat models, especially when we're looking at things like mobile networks, where even securing buys and things like that are significant. But having this bilateral, this mutual authentication of the entities that are the endpoints of a call, or at least the end networks of a call, really helps with the threat model. I don't know if this requires recharter to look at this, but my question is really, do we want to adopt? And anybody have any thoughts, comments, think this is cool, think this is useless? Good time to start.
Murray, if you have any thoughts about the recharter question, I'd love to hear them.
Before you speak, Mary, which is just, the original scope of STIR, the threat model and the problem statement, are really focused on callers, right? That you're trying to spam, prevent, voicemail hacking and things like that. It is a different threat model to be looking at, did I end up reaching the entity that I wanted to reach, and can I have an assurance from that? And that's why I think there's effectively a separate threat model and problem statement built into this document. It builds on earlier work, 4916, but just with that preface. So, Murray.
I'm happy to help you recharter if you think that it stretches the boundaries a little bit. I'm not worried about this terribly. I'm happy to help you sort through this so that it goes smoothly.
Okay.
So I guess it would help me to know who have we got in the room today that thinks this is something that it's time to address this, and they'll put effort in on really exploring the problem and making sure that we're doing the right thing.
Well, several people have spoken in the chat saying they think this is good. Is there anyone who want to speak against? At least one person's not sure it's needed.
You're welcome to speak your mind, man.
Okay, well, we are out of time, so we're not going to get to the next presentation, but I'm not hearing anyone speak against, just one who's not sure it's needed.
And I too worry that, like, what's the thing in 2429 now, the additional identity or whatever, that there are going to be solutions to the marketplace. They're going to try to do this in ways that I think are not but bluntly, that are just less secure. And so, yeah, I think it's important that we articulate a way to do that, especially as potential alternatives to the marketplace start to bubble up.
Okay, I think we're going to have to stop here and continue on the list, and clearly we'll be having an interim. All right, thank you all.